Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Today we're going to be,
Tackling someone whose work can be a little, well, dense, to say the least.
yeah,
But,
that's why you tune in, right? To
yeah,
get to the bottom of these thinkers and their ideas.
right.
And today we're diving into the work of Ludwig von Mises.
Specifically his work on the foundations of economics.
Right.
You sent over some really interesting excerpts, so I'm very curious to hear what our expert makes of them.
Yeah, so Ludwig von Mises was a really prominent figure in Austrian economics.
And he really emphasized this idea of individual action, as like the core driver of economics.
It's less about kind of like cold, hard data.
And more about the human choices that are behind every transaction, right?
Okay, so less about graphs and charts.
And more about the why behind every buy and sell.
Right.
It sounds like Mises would say that economics is, at its core, psychology.
Absolutely, yeah.
One of the excerpts that you provided that I thought was really interesting was he uses this example of a baker. And I thought it was a great illustration, kind of a microcosm.
And this idea, right.
Yeah.
He uses this simple act, the baking bread.
To highlight this point that, at its core, economics is about people serving one another.
Exactly, yeah. The baker isn't baking to, like, defeat his customers.
Or even just to enrich himself. He's baking to fulfill a need, right? And in doing so,
he's creating something of value for other people, which in turn benefits him as well.
it's like a beautiful illustration of this concept of spontaneous order in a free market.
It's interesting how something as, I don't know, seemingly simple as baking bread.
Can really challenge kind of how we traditionally view economics.
But Mises, he doesn't stop there, right? He goes on to challenge the reliance on statistics in economic analysis.
Yeah.
Which seems, I don't know, almost counterintuitive. So help me understand this a little bit better.
Yeah, so I think what's really fascinating about Mises is he doesn't dismiss statistics entirely.
It's more that he cautions against relying on statistics as like the sole basis
For understanding, these complex economic phenomena.
Okay.
He believed that while statistics can be useful for offering kind of a snapshot of the past,
They can't really fully predict the future, right? Especially when you're dealing with something as dynamic and unpredictable as human behavior.
right, and if human behavior is at the core of his economic theory, it would make sense that he wouldn't see statistics as the end-all be-all.
Right.
The example he gives about mortality tables I thought was really, really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because he points out that even something like mortality rates, as kind of fits as that might seem.
We're constantly evolving based on a whole bunch of different factors.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, mortality tables are influenced by, like, everything.
From advancements in medical technology to, changes in lifestyle choices.
And even, like, cultural attitudes towards risk.
So while they can tell us something about past trends, they can't fully account for this, constant evolution of human behavior and how that's going to impact the future.
Which leads us to another key point in these excerpts, which is his critique of what he termed social engineering.
Right.
And it seems like this ties in directly with his views on the limitations of statistics and the ever-evolving nature of human choice, right?
Absolutely. So Mises argued that, attempts to plan or control society
Like it's some kind of like machine, just based on this past data.
and kind of this predetermined vision of the future are ultimately doomed to fail.
Yeah, because such approaches ignore, that dynamism of individual choice.
Right.
Like people's ability to adapt.
To innovate, to come up with solutions that, central planners could never have even anticipated.
And that makes me think about, just even in recent history, all of the regulations and policies that get enacted based on what seemed like, really solid data at the time.
Right.
But what seems good in theory doesn't always play out the way we expect it to.
Because human behavior is so hard to predict and account for.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's not that like regulations or policies are inherently bad. It's more about recognizing the limitations of trying to control these very, very complex systems from the top down.
Mises argued that those kinds of attempts often end up, stifling innovation and creating these unintended consequences.
But then ripple through the entire system.
Yeah, it's like trying to play chess, but you're only allowed to move your pieces in these predetermined patterns.
Right.
You eliminate all of the strategy, the creativity, the potential for kind of this unexpected brilliance
Yeah.
that makes the game so compelling in the first place.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And Mises actually provides a great one in the excerpts, too.
He compares central planning to a game where the winner is, like, preordained.
You know, it takes away the individual's ability to strategize, to compete.
And ultimately to discover new and innovative ways to succeed.
And that, for Mises, was like the antithesis of what it means to have a thriving and dynamic society.
So if we can't rely solely on statistics and we can't control or predict human behavior,
how do we make sense of economics at all? I'm sensing that for Mises, the answer lies in understanding those individual choices, right?
yeah.
But why behind them?
Exactly. Yeah, and Mises, he actually introduces this term,
Thymology?
thymology.
Which sounds really complicated.
It just really
It's basically just about understanding the motivations
and the values
that drive our choices.
Okay, firmology. So it's like stepping inside the mind.
Of the consumer, the investor, the entrepreneur.
Yeah,
To understand that why.
precisely.
Yeah, so think about it this way. Imagine, like,
You're trying to understand why.
some companies thrive during a recession.
Right. A purely statistical approach might just kind of like,
Look at past economic data, try to project those trends into the future.
which we've already established is a pretty risky strategy.
Exactly right.
Because people aren't always predictable.
In that way, right. So thymology would say,
We need to go beyond just the numbers here, right? We need to consider things like,
what's the company's long-term vision?
how adaptable are they to change?
Even like, the personal values of the people in charge.
So it's about adding that context.
That nuance, that human story.
Right.
To those dry economic models.
Exactly.
But how do we actually apply thymology? We're not mind readers.
Well, so Mises would argue that, in a sense.
We're all engaging in thymology all the time.
Whether we realize it or not.
Okay.
Every time you
try to predict how a friend's going to react to a piece of news.
or you're trying to anticipate a client's needs in a negotiation.
You're using thymology.
You're trying to understand their motivation. Right.
So we're all amateur economists in a way, trying to make sense of the market.
Of human behavior.
Exactly.
But if this inherent subjectivity is everywhere,
Right.
does it mean that all economic forecasts?
Are basically just guesswork.
Not necessarily.
But Mises was very, very wary of any approach that claimed to be able to predict the future with 100% certainty. He believed that, in a sense,
Every action we take
is a kind of speculation.
based on, our understanding of the world and our expectations about the future.
So even something as simple as, I don't know, buying a cup of coffee
Right.
is based on a prediction about the future.
Exactly. You're speculating that
You're going to enjoy that coffee.
you're going to have time to drink it.
That the coffee shop isn't going to suddenly close down.
That's where you get there.
Every action, big or small.
Carries some degree of risk and uncertainty.
That's a really interesting way to look at it.
But in our day-to-day lives, those risks seem so small.
That we don't even think about them.
And that's where Mises would argue that,
We can.
we can get into trouble.
Particularly in the realm of like long-term economic planning.
Oh, okay.
We tend to underestimate the uncertainty of the future.
We assume that things will continue in this kind of like predictable way.
Because they always have.
Like assuming that the stock market will keep going up.
Right.
Just because it has for the last few years.
And Mises was very critical of this kind of what he called
trend-based thinking,
especially in the context of these,
complex systems like the economy.
He really believed it was a recipe for disaster.
Because trends can change, and relying on them blindly
Right.
ignores all those individual choices and actions
Exactly.
that are actually driving the system.
Precisely.
And that's where Mises' emphasis on
individual action.
entrepreneurial spirit really comes in, right?
He believed that in a world of constant change and uncertainty,
It's the individual's ability to adapt, to innovate, to respond to those changes.
that really drives progress.
So instead of trying to control those outcomes based on past data,
We should be focused on creating systems that foster that adaptability, that innovation. It's less about picking winners and losers,
right?
and more about setting the stage for success
Exactly.
to kind of emerge more organically.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, and this idea of
Focusing on individuals rather than these aggregates.
it wasn't just limited to his view of kind of
Spontaneous order in the market. It actually formed
the basis of his critique of macroeconomics, right?
Okay.
Which he found deeply, deeply flawed.
Oh, this should be good. I've always found those discussions about like
national GDP and inflation to be a little over my head, so...
Ready, walk me through it. How did Mises view this macro view of the economy?
So he argued that, by focusing solely on these kind of like big picture statistics.
Things like national income or inflation rates,
Mm.
it can actually obscure the real drivers of economic activity.
It creates this illusion
That you can just kind of like adjust a few levers.
and steer the entire economy in the direction that you want it to go.
When in reality, right,
It's the millions of individual decisions
kind of happening every day.
that are really shaping things.
It's like trying to understand how a movie works.
Just by looking at the box office numbers,
Right,
you might know how much money it made.
right.
You're missing kind of the story
The characters, the artistry.
that really make it special.
Exactly. And Mises would argue that,
This overemphasis on these aggregate data,
often leads to this belief in the efficacy of,
social engineering.
Yeah.
This idea that
governments can effectively control these complex systems from the top down.
because if you're just focused on manipulating these big picture numbers,
Right.
it might seem like you can kind of just like steer the economy in
Right.
whatever direction you want. But as we've been discussing,
Human behavior doesn't really work that way.
exactly. Yeah, Mises was incredibly skeptical of this kind of like
Top-down approach,
he believed that it ignored the inherent
the
complexity.
dynamism of a system.
It's really driven by those individual choices.
Those values, those actions.
It's like trying to direct a movie by only looking at spreadsheets.
Right.
You might hit your budget targets, but
It's probably not going to be a very good movie.
right. And just like a movie needs,
Talented individuals all working together.
each with their own kind of unique skills and perspectives.
A thriving economy requires that same kind of
Freedom for individuals to make choices
based on their own assessment.
of risk and opportunity.
So how do we get away from this trap?
Of trying to control things from the top down. Where do we focus our attention if we're not just looking at these big aggregate numbers?
Yeah. Well, Mises, he emphasizes this idea of, he calls it methodological individualism.
Okay.
And it's this idea that all economic phenomena
Ultimately stem from the actions and choices
of individuals.
So instead of just looking at like GDP growth,
right.
we should be studying the decisions
Of the entrepreneurs, the investors.
the everyday consumers whose actions are actually driving that growth.
Exactly.
It's about connecting those dots.
Yeah. Understanding the human stories.
Behind the statistics.
Precisely. Because it's those individual choices, right?
Those seemingly small acts of
Buying and selling, investing, creating
really form the foundation
of a functioning economy.
This has been incredibly eye-opening.
So much of what we hear about economics is focused on these big complex systems, and
It's easy to forget that it all boils down to individual human beings.
making choices
Mm.
based on their own unique circumstances and goals.
And that's really, the beauty of Mises' work, right? It's this reminder that
Economics isn't just this collection of kind of like
abstract
airy
theory,
equations, right?
it's a reflection of human action.
Driven by, the same
That's
hopes
an aspiration.
that have always kind of
Exactly.
shaped the course of history.
It's this powerful reminder that true progress and prosperity come not from
This top-down control, but from empowering those individuals
right
to pursue their own goals
and contribute their own unique talents.
to the world.
Absolutely.
This has been great. I've learned a lot preparing for this one, and I think our listeners have to.
So for those listening who are maybe just starting to explore Mises' work, where would you recommend they go next? What's like one key takeaway they can take with them from this deep dive?
I think the most important thing to remember is that,
Economics is not a spectator sport
we're all participants.
in this incredibly complex
But-
system.
And our choices,
They're small.
have ripple effects.
So engage with these ideas.
Think critically about the systems around you.
And never underestimate the power of individual actions.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to dive deeper into those ideas on your own. Thanks for joining us for another illuminating deep dive. Until next time.